Hi, welcome to this lecture on virtue. This lecture is a single presentation. It's just me, no Q&A, and the PowerPoint is below. Let's think of a beholder of humankind. It's apt to think of this as God. It could also be an allegorical being who is God-like. And I want to bring these different possibilities together, that is God and an allegory that is God-like, together and speak of God joy, kind of making the theism, strictly speaking, optional. But I still think we need God-like beings in our thought. God joy is benevolent towards the whole of humankind and super knowledgeable. She, I say she, because I think a little bit more of joy. She is, as it were, looking over your shoulder, looking inside of you, even, godlike. Being benevolent towards the whole of humankind, what God joy finds beautiful corresponds to the good of the whole, okay? And your responsibility then is, well, she says to you, make me proud of you. She's calling to you, make me proud of you. Now you can see this guy has a question about that. But anyhow, your chief duty in life then is advancing the good of the whole, trying to align with what advances the good of the whole. Virtue then corresponds to what advances the good of the whole. The good of the whole is a way of thinking about sort of the results, the consequences of one's action or conduct. And that corresponds, we find again, to a notion of good conduct, proper conduct. You can think of this as two different approaches to ethics. This one is sort of the consequentialist frame, and this one is the deontological duties frame of doing your duty, and this one is doing good for the whole. And the important thing is that these must be sustained and developed together. They are not separate from each other. They work together, and that's an essential thing to understand, I feel, in doing ethics properly. And so I call this the correspondence between the two goods, which is to say the good of the whole and good conduct, the more consequentialist frame of mind and the more deontological frame of mind. Now, it sounds rather oppressive, perhaps. Oh, I always have to advance the good of the whole. But remember, you are part of the good of the whole. That is to say, you are part of the whole. So doing good by yourself, to yourself, is advancing the good of the whole. And you're not fitted to do anything better than to advance, for example, your health, your comfort, your enjoyment of day-to-day activities. There's nothing you're better at, in a sense. And furthermore, there's no one better than you at advancing your own health, comfort, and enjoyment of day-to-day activities. So this very broad ethical precept, advance the good of the whole, gives a lot of latitude and authorization for you to focus on your own health, comfort, and enjoyment of day-to-day activities. God joy then is universal, looking on the whole of humankind. And in that sense, you can kind of associate it with absolute. But on the other hand, she's very sensitive to history, to time and place, and the specifics of where the situation is, how it got there, and so on. And so once again, we see a kind of transcending of a kind of familiar demarcation between relativism and absolutism, she kind of transcends this. This approach transcends it because these are all different nodes in time and place, in possible histories that she sees, right? She's super knowledgeable, she's godlike. And, in most cases, like, let's say these are issues of whether or not you should steal bread. And in most cases, she's going to say, no, you shouldn't. She's going to stick to the, presumption, the precept of you don't steal, of course. But, in some particular desperate situations, it could be that she says, yeah, steal the bread. Like in this particular case, it's so extreme, steal the bread. And so, it does permit those variations based on time and place. So history has its place within her entire view of all possible worlds, as it were, all possible histories and situations. So at the same, it's both kind of universalistic and a single view of what is good. Not that we have great access to that, of course, as mere mortals, but still the idea of a single kind of view, but that is historically specific. Now, people disagree about what constitutes the good of the whole, what is the picture of the good life, and so on. And furthermore, what leads to whatever it is that constitutes the good of the whole. So disagreement is very, very much to be expected, okay? And let me add that this is one reason why I draw so much from Adam Smith, because recognizing the need to accommodate and tolerate all of this disagreement about, because, God joy is God joy. We are mere human beings, and we don't know. And so we're going to disagree so profoundly. Adam Smith's liberal outlook is suitable to an awareness of how profoundly we are going to disagree on what constitutes the good of the whole and what leads to whatever it is that constitutes the good of the whole. So I encourage you to think of virtue as upward. I think it's important for us to affirm this kind of metaphor of looking up to what is virtuous and sublime, kind of associating it with upward movement, and vice downward. Okay, this is Bill Mazeroski, who died a few years back. He made it into the Hall of Fame. He played in the 50s, 60s, maybe the 70s. And he was a great baseball player, and he was especially good in defense, in fielding. And this brings me to the issue of, is virtue a single integrated thing, or is it a topic of different virtues? Like there are different virtues, and they each deserve their sort of recognition and analysis. And the answer is both. The answer is both. So fielding in baseball is, one dimension of baseball, which Bill Mazeroski excelled in. And fielding itself then can be broken down into dimensions or facets. For example, catching, range, throwing, and so on. So it's natural to kind of see subcategories kind of nested within a category. And we do this very naturally, I feel, with virtues. So fielding is one facet or category or dimension of baseball. There's hitting, there's running, there's pitching, and so on. And if you want to think of baseball as a kind of virtue, it would be but one, right? Bill Mazeroski, how is Bill Mazeroski doing in virtue? You could ask about his parenting, his duties to his other family members, his duties to his friends, et cetera, et cetera. So you see, like take hygiene. We could focus on the virtue of dental hygiene, but then there's other things to be hygienic about. And so, hygiene can be also seen as a subdivision of, say, prudence, which would also include preparation, skill development, and so on. So you can bring these subcategory and frames forward and kind of refine things. So virtue then has prudence as part of it, but also other cardinal virtues, fortitude, beneficence, temperance, and so on. Okay, so you can see this kind of structure here. So you end up both with sub-virtues, so multiple, but also a notion of them rolling up to a larger integrated virtue, okay? And virtues can be listed in great number. This is something I pulled from the web, a so-called master list, and this only goes up from A to I. So just to make you realize that it's not like there's some special enumeration of virtues to worry about. Now, some people sometimes think of virtue as some kind of recipe or formula for being good, and you got to do so much of each and get the recipe right, and then you're on track and you're being good and doing your duty. Kind of like as though you need to be 20% prudence, 25% of your effort and attention should go to patience, some percent to charity, to fidelity, to industriousness, a kind of pie chart approach to virtue. And that's not, I don't think, a good way to think about it. I think rather we look at conduct through different lenses, and these virtues give us different lenses to consider the conduct we look at. So think of Rick's conduct at the end of Casablanca, if you know the movie. And you can take different lenses to it. You could take a generosity lens to it, a magnanimity lens, a courage lens, justice, prudence. They all kind of relate, actually. And you could analyze, the conduct and the virtuousness of it through any of those, and they could all be useful. So I think of virtues, when we get down to, more specific virtues like these, as lenses, okay? They're lenses, and they're not necessarily very definitive. Obviously, some, and for certain pictures of conduct, scenes of conduct, certain lenses will be more useful, more apt than others. And it depends on, the conversation you're having. Okay. Now, I just want to say that sports metaphors like baseball, I think, are very useful in talking about virtue, both in that you can talk about the subdivisions or subdimensions that go into what makes good baseball: fielding, hitting, pitching, and then what makes good fielding, range, throwing, running, and so on. So that's useful. And another thing that's useful about sports metaphors, I feel, is that we can talk about different standards or levels, like high school baseball, college baseball, single A, double A, triple A, major leagues, and that there's different standards or levels that we have in mind, we refer to. But in some ways, sports metaphors are, I think, misleading. And that's particularly in that there's fairly definite knowledge about people's performance in sports. We are all in the arena spectating. It's all on camera. The statisticians are collecting all the data. We know exactly, what batting average Bill Mazeroski finished up with. We know about his fielding percentage. We know all of these things that are kind of defined and measured. And that's rather different than virtue, in that hospitality, say. I mean, do we have a definite formula? Do we keep statistics on it? Are there measurements? Are they shared? Is the information shared commonly and universally? So that's different, and that's worth keeping in mind. Okay, now a word for when something advances the good of the whole is beneficial. And we can then think of the beneficialness of conduct or action. And I want to furthermore break this down into things that are quite immediately beneficial, agreeable to people. They're naturally even attracted to it and welcoming of it because it's so immediately agreeable, as opposed to something which may not be like that, but which is useful to purposes that will pay off further in time to something agreeable. Okay. So versus useful. So agreeable means kind of like an immediate benefit. Useful means sort of like a roundabout or down the road benefit. So ice cream, for example, is immediately agreeable. So that does good on agreeable. And a wheelbarrow is not particularly agreeable, but it makes a lovely garden. It makes a lovely yard. And those things in the future then are agreeable. So that's one distinction I want to make with beneficialness. And another I want to make, and then we're going to start talking about Jim's behavior here. And this is all in the eyes and assessment of Mary here. So Mary is making a kind of moral judgment of Jim's behavior. And the other distinction I want to make here is about Jim's action is beneficial to others, other people, non-Jims, as it were, non-Jims, such as, for example, Janet. I'll speak of Janet as representing all the others, versus beneficial to Jim himself. Okay, so we've got two distinctions here: agreeable, useful, beneficial to others, beneficial to Jim. And I want to make now a little scheme, and this follows David Hume's second inquiry. So Jim's action is useful to others, such as Janet, and Hume gives the example here of fairness and kindness. Those are, characteristics of Jim's action that are useful to others, such as Janet. And then his action can be useful to himself, such as his own industry, discretion, prudence. Down the road, these things pay off for Jim himself. So you see, you can categorize virtues, see them in different ways, all of this being beneficial, all of this being for the good of to the good of the whole. And then Jim's action is agreeable to Janet. Wit, politeness, decency. These are all things that Hume gives as examples. And agreeable to Jim himself, say cheerfulness. He, enjoys his own company, as it were. So this is a kind of scheme. And again, all this is sort of Mary thinking about all the different aspects of Jim's conduct. And, his conduct can have elements of all of these, and even some of these will have spillovers into different cells. And so it's all really quite complicated. It's a lot to think about, really. Let me quote Burke here about his concern. If there's a lot to think about, and we think people have to kind of reason through the consequentialism of every action, it's a lot to think about, and it's a lot to keep in mind. Trying to trace out, well, who's it beneficial for and in what way? And so he said he was concerned about this. He said, we are afraid to put men to live in trade, each on his own private stock of reason, because we suspect that this stock in each man is small, and that the individuals would do better to avail themselves of the general bank and capital of nations and of ages. So somehow we need guides rather than trying to think through every moment in judging action, including our own action. Okay. So again, it's a lot to think about. And, this guy got the message from God, joy, make me proud of you, but that is very platitudinous. It's worth affirming. It is definitely to be affirmed that we should make God, joy, proud of us. But it's a platitude. And what do we do with it? How do we think through it? And so just as this guy says here in response, we may want to include more specific instructions. So where do we look to for instructions? And this brings us to Smith's notion of propriety. And so in the world, because we're all different and we have, like I said, we all disagree somewhat about what's virtuous and what's good. If we're observing someone's conduct, say Jim's conduct, and we're all sort of in the room together, kind of assessing it. If you go around the room, we're all going to give somewhat different answers, maybe because we have slightly different standards or slightly different notions of what constitutes the good, or of what serves what leads to what constitutes the good, and so on. We give slightly different answers, but in a community of some kind, situated in history and time and place, there'll be some sense of a range, a region of fair to middling, of okay. And this is what Smith calls propriety. And it's being indexed here by J, kind of to suggest community J, or reference group J, or relevant standard for Jim, the actor, maybe based on Jim's age. Just like with the high school baseball, college baseball, single A baseball. So this is fair to middling. Above it is praiseworthy. Below it is blameworthy. And this is the sense that we develop, a sense of propriety through our experience of social life. Social life becomes a kind of school, and we observe these notions of propriety, and these cue us about what's acceptable, what deserves praise, what deserves blame, what are the relevant standards, and so on. Now let's consider stepping up to some scary situation or something and think that maybe the praiseworthiness here is in courage as a kind of virtue, or as the kind of virtue here. One way to think about this propriety benchmark is that it separates courage from cowardice. So then it's Jim stepping up to face these fears, and that's praiseworthy, as opposed to not facing the fears adequately, and that's blameworthy. But there's another side to courage, and that could be going too far in stepping up, in getting into trouble, into getting in over your head, okay? And that's presumptuous rashness, okay? So then on the other side of courage, you have a different propriety separation, where this again is praiseworthiness and courage, and now the blameworthiness goes with being, rushing in too readily and messing up the scene, or getting yourself into trouble, or making trouble, and that's presumptuous rashness. So you see, you kind of have this propriety mark, a propriety mark on either side, and that's shown in this Aristotelian type of framing, where you have a virtue like courage of stepping up when there's scary things. And if you have a deficiency, it's cowardice, an excess, rashness. So you have vice, virtue, vice, okay? And you can do this with virtues, generally speaking. So for frugality, which is a mindfulness about your spending, if you have a deficiency of such mindfulness, profusion, and if you have an excess of such mindfulness, you're penny pinching, avarice. Magnanimity, kind of a bigness of soul. If you have a deficiency, pusillanimity. And if you have you're overdoing it, you're thinking too big of yourself in a way, arrogance. And you can put this, so I call this 3V framing, vice, virtue, vice, 3V framing. And you can put this into this kind of picture, where the upwardness is, as I say, virtue is upward, praiseworthiness is upward. You have courage here in this kind of mediocrity, meaning only that it's between a vice and a vice, deficiency and excess. And so this is the stepping up when things are scary. This is a deficiency, vice of cowardice. This is the virtue of doing it at the right level, okay? And it kind of peaks here. And this propriety here would be referenced, to some standard, which just becomes praiseworthy. And the further up it is, the more praiseworthy it is. But then you can step up too much and you become presumptuously rash and you fall back down here to blameworthiness or to blameworthy, and in the range now of vice. Okay. So this is the way this propriety thing works, 3V framing. And these proprieties are kind of senses we pick up, which provide those kind of cues about good conduct, benchmarks, rules of thumb, sensibilities in the moment, so you're not thinking through everything. Again, 3V framing. Now, there's a very special virtue that Smith speaks of, and it's commutative justice. I use the expression commutative to distinguish it from other forms of justice, two other forms of justice that Smith recognizes and works with. But commutative justice, the most sacred laws are to not mess with your neighbor's life and person, property and possessions, and promises due. Not mess, if you think of those things, life and person, property, and promises due as your neighbor's stuff, not messing with your neighbor's stuff. And this is very special, this kind of virtue. He speaks of it as abstaining from what is another's, an expression that goes back in natural jurisprudence for centuries. I prefer not messing with other people's stuff. You can see that they correspond here neatly. And I just think that this formulation is neater because it parses more neatly and lends itself to analysis better. And its rules are precise and accurate, whereas all the other virtues have rules loose, vague, and indeterminate, like we see here. This is courage, propriety, prudence, temperance, hospitality, etc., hygiene, and so on. But commutative justice is very special. It evolved to be precise and accurate, and it's very different. It's quite different, and it provides a kind of social grammar to society, which is especially important in the modern complex world. And in fact, grammar is part of Smith's analogy in talking about rules of moral conduct. So he's talking about the specialness of commutative justice as opposed to all other virtues. And its rules, commutative justice's rules, are precise and accurate. All other virtues, loose, vague, and indeterminate. And this rules of conduct, he makes the analogy of rules of writing. And CJ is like grammar because it provides you with these set of rules which you are to abide by and are considered absolutely required. And if you don't abide by them, you get penalized, you get marked down for that. But at least beyond grammar school, if you do all your grammar perfectly, you don't get any praise for that. It's just expected. For commutative justice, if you go through your whole day without messing with anybody's stuff, nobody applauds you for that. It's expected. If you do mess with someone's stuff, you're going to get whacked. We hope, but you don't get any praise for that. So here you can see that feedback on how well your performance accords with each. This is only negative, whereas this, as we've seen, can be both negative and positive, both blameworthy and praiseworthy. Okay. Now, we've talked about God's approval. God joy's approval, corresponding to beneficialness. And Mary's approval, Mary's just another human being, not God joy. We aspires also to correspond to beneficialness, but we've talked about the difficulty of trying to think in purely consequentialist terms, think through all the wide consequences of everything. So Smith's approach here is to put a phase, to recognize a phase, which we've already talked about, actually, between here to help us understand how we actually, come to moral approval or approbation. And so what he says here is that we've got the propriety phase in between, and that all these things aspire to correspond, but kind of to understand how things actually work, you really need to recognize this propriety phase rather than thinking that we kind of think through the whole calculation or calculus of beneficialness. In this picture, by the way, you can see the correspondence between the two goods, the good of the whole and good conduct. Okay, this is what we talked about earlier. This is the more consequentialist frame of or approach, and this is the more deontological approach. Okay. Now, as it happens, this propriety, if we stop and think about it, is a kind of agreeableness. Look back at some of Hume's examples here. Politeness, that sounds a little bit like propriety. Decency sounds a little bit like propriety. And in fact, in Theory of Moral Sentiments, Smith often speaks of propriety as agreeableness, as becoming something which people find agreeable. They kind of, are taken aback when people violate propriety terribly. So in fact, this scheme here, it's kind of presented as a kind of calculus of beneficialness, but in a funny way, propriety is already sort of incorporated here, which kind of complicates things. But that's just the way it is. And I think Smith was quite aware of this, in fact. And so I think it's useful to think about a spiral relationship here in our thinking about propriety, good conduct, and down here at the bottom of the spiral, the good of the whole or beneficialness. So certain proprieties, this is kind of spiraling through time. Each loop is indexed by I, and this spiral we can also think of as coming up from the screen. We hope that this progression is upward in wisdom and virtue. So propriety in time and space, time and place, becomes some customary, traditional, and becomes something agreeable, right? And it's important that we respect that. So that agreeableness now enters into our understanding of the beneficialness of conduct. Remember, this was agreeable and useful to Jim and to Janet. Well, if propriety becomes agreeable, it enters into beneficialness as agreeable, you see. And we have a new, better understanding of beneficialness. Now, this better understanding of the world, how things work, the way things are, what the customs of the place are, and so on, this will also lead us to maybe refine and reconsider and perhaps adjust our notions of propriety. And so in the next period here, propriety might be a little different. It's not a profoundly different change, presumably, but it's going to be, let's say, a little bit different. Propriety I+1. Okay, I mean, society is evolving. Moral attitudes are evolving. not necessarily dramatically, but, moving along. And then that propriety becomes a kind of agreeableness, and therefore feeds into a slightly different understanding of beneficialness, I plus 2. So you see, this represents the correspondence between the two goods. This is down here, the good of the whole, and our understanding of the good of the whole, or the beneficialness of conduct. This is our understanding of good conduct, the deontological frame of mind, and different notions of propriety evolving. But we work this whole spiral, this is the key, understanding that they're related and that we're working a spiral, and it's our job to work a spiral such that we make the two correspond. That's not to say that, the society we observe is going to correspond as we think it ought, but our notions of these things, all of these things are, after all, Mary's, as it were, Mary's understandings. Again, we are mere human beings. We are not God joy. So this spiral is about our progression, we hope, upward towards God joy. Okay. So customs, conventions, expectations play a role inside of propriety. That's important to emphasize, I think. History, in other words, plays a role inside of ethics. But ethics is not reduced to history. There's still a sense of there being an overall beholder who transcends time and place and so on. But these things are playing a role inside of that. Okay. Let me mention that Smith often couples wisdom with virtue and speaks of wisdom and virtue. There's about 22 pairings of the two throughout Theory of Moral Sentiments. Makes sense, right? Because to act virtuously, you need to know that understanding of propriety, that understanding of beneficialness, wisdom. So naturally, wisdom and virtue have a sort of two sides of the same coin nature to them. Now, I want to mention a number of other topics that I'm not going to go into any detail on before finishing up with a couple other points. One is Smith's distinction between the amiable and respectable virtues. I treat this in another video, which you can check out. Another is virtue as opposed to traits like beauty. I mean, someone's beauty can be agreeable as well. And so, Jim is beautiful, so that's agreeable. Does that mean that that's one of Jim's virtues? Is beauty one of Jim's virtues? I don't think so. I mean, in some ways, his beauty might be virtuous in that it does reflect his conduct and his effort, his taking care of himself, his prudence, his hygiene, and so on. So yes, in that respect, but just, if someone's just endowed with beauty, that does not, in my book, count as virtue in the way that we're talking about it here. Very important and related is the whole complex of intentions, which relate to propriety, and then merit, consequences or results of the conduct, and the role of luck. And this is treated in Smith in a neat way. And the point is that results do indeed affect our moral judgments and therefore depend or are influenced by luck, or what he calls fortune. So fortune and luck do play a role in our moral judgments of people's conduct. And the reason this is because of knowledge problems, that we have to depend on results because we don't have, it's not like baseball where we carefully observe and measure and track people's minute bodily movements, even their intentions. We don't have that kind of knowledge. And so we just have to depend on results. And therefore, we're going to be influenced by fortune or luck. It's just the way of the modern complex world. There's no way around it. Get used to it, but it's a very interesting matter. Virtue and habit, especially bad habits, is worthy of further discussion. Virtue is not necessarily just a matter of a single action, but a habit of action and so on. Talking about how when we manage passions through what Smith calls self-command is something worth pursuing. Virtue and friendship being based on virtue and that kind of thing, he speaks of. Virtue and self-deceit, how we deceive ourselves, and in fact, how that's a problem of managing some of our troublesome passions is worth pursuing. Virtue and political philosophy generally, I would say, is very worth pursuing. So let me finish up with a question. What are you? A human being? What is a human being? A will? A mind? A person? Maybe a soul? Some people speak of your conscious self as sort of the rider who is riding an elephant, who actually has a force and will of its own. And Jonathan Haidt says that for the most part, our rider is not steering this elephant, but is rationalizing where the elephant goes, fancying the notion that it is steering the elephant. And so you could think of consciousness versus subconscious, the subconscious. And then there's the conscience, okay, that which nags us about our past behavior. Smith calls that the man within the breast. So I don't think there's any very definite ontology of the human being. I think it's elusive. I think it's always going to be elusive. Another idea is the republic of passions, which Smith is an expression Smith uses in referring to Plato. But maybe some answers are that you are a soul, you have or even own a person, that you are, to use Eric Madson's expression, a locus of affirmations or reaffirmations. The affirmations include that you persist through time, you have a will, a faculty of judgment, that is, the cause of your conduct. You cohere, but also evolve. So Imago Dei is, I think, worth thinking about here, and certainly enters into the theory of moral sentiments. Smith says speaks of the all-wise author of nature, having made man, if I may say so, the immediate judge of mankind, and has in this respect, as in many others, created him after his own image. He says this demigod, this man within the breast, the conscience, this demigod within the breast appears like the demigods of the poets, partly of immortal extraction, when his judgments are steadily and firmly directed by the sense of praiseworthiness and blameworthiness. He seems to act suitably to his divine extraction. So this is something worth affirming and reaffirming. And I think the most important word here is directed, are steadily and firmly directed by the sense of praiseworthiness and blameworthiness. It's not about, hitting some mark. It's not about, gee, you hit the pattern, you hit the template. It's about efforts to be more aligned with what serves the good of the whole. It's about this effort to direct your conduct and character in this way. It's not about, as it were, where you are, what you've accomplished, and so on. It's a constant call upward from wherever you are and so on. It's not about how far up you are in some relative sense to either other people, but rather it's about your own development. It's more about your own history up till now. So it's not, virtue is not so much about being accomplished or polished. In fact, even a very highly accomplished person can shrink morally and lose the way of virtue. Virtue is always about from this moment forward. Of course, that moment is very much shaped and conditioned by the past and your experience and your knowledge, your wisdom, your habits, and everything else, your culture, your community, your traditions, and everything else. But it's about this moment forward. It's not about any particular mold of behavior. It's about a sense of upwardness or upward vitality. So virtue is a locus of reaffirmation, the affirmation of virtue itself, the affirmation of God joy, of one's allegiance to God joy. And Smith speaks of the desire to be respectable and respected. He speaks of this as the road. He says specifically the road of wisdom and virtue. And this road notion relates to the expression, the pursuit of happiness. So this is another topic worth pondering more, which is the relationship of virtue to the pursuit of happiness. Virtue corresponds, as we've said, to the good of the whole. Does that also mean that it corresponds to the good of you? And in a funny way, I think it does, but it's about what really you should find to be your good, okay? Or in a way, what truer happiness really consists of. So summary, we've spoken of God joy, correspondence of the good of the whole and good conduct, and how this correspondence is not an accident. It's something we presuppose as we move forward in thinking about ethics. It's sort of like an organon of our ethics, this presupposition of a correspondence. We're going to make these two things, the good of the whole and good conduct, correspond. We talked about the more integral virtue, and then its subcategories, sub-virtues, and so on, how that's all fit together. Virtues as lenses, not a sort of pie chart approach. Beneficialness, we talked about as being, you can make a division between agreeableness and usefulness. We spoke of propriety, 3V framing, vice, virtue, vice, framing. We talked about commutative justice as a very special virtue. Its rules are precise and accurate. It's the only virtue whose rules are precise and accurate, and it provides a sort of social grammar. Propriety as a sort of agreeableness, that's something we talked about. We talked about how history plays a role inside of ethics, raised issues of the ontology or nature of the human being, virtue as upward vitality, a locus of reaffirmations. Oh, and finally, virtue and the pursuit of happiness. And I believe, yeah, that's it, folks. So thank you very much. And I hope this was of interest, and be well. Take care.